Today we are continuing on in our study of Genesis with Genesis 22 and 23. So we have seen quite the journey for Abraham and Sarah. God has made these promises. They have waited and waited and waited. And finally last week we see that Isaac is born, the son of the promise. And we've seen Abraham and Sarah struggle with some doubt, with some sin. We've seen some failures along the way. But today we're going to see what I believe is after this long journey of faith, showing Abraham's obedience and his deepening trust in God. Now, Genesis 22 is probably a very familiar story to you. We've all heard it in Sunday school, and it's probably one that we've heard quite a few times. But again, hoping we will gain something new today as we study Genesis 22. So if we start in Genesis 22, right in the very first verse, we see that God calls to Abraham. And we would need to pause even right here because Abraham's response is, "Here I am." That same response is used multiple times in Scripture. We see it with Moses. When God comes to him in the burning bush, he calls Moses. Moses says, "Here I am." We see it when God calls to Samuel. When Samuel's just a boy, he calls to him and Samuel says, "Here I am." We see it with Isaiah. We see it with Ananias when God calls on him to go and heal Paul. So we see this pattern. This word, "here I am," is actually, or this phrase is actually one word in Hebrew. It's Hineni. And the word actually means behold. But when we're talking about it here in this context of "here I am," it literally means behold me, pointing to oneself. And what it indicates is this posture of a servant. It's a response to a call, indicating a readiness for the person to listen to or obey. So when Abraham responds with "here I am," he's indicating that he's a willing servant. Before God has even asked anything of him, he's ready to obey. He's ready to listen. Abraham obviously had no idea what God was going to call him to do, but his response was one of submission. On all these other examples, God was asking these people to do something extraordinarily difficult, but their immediate response was, "Here I am," a willing servant. And then we see that Abraham does not hesitate to obey. He hears what God has asked of him. It's incredibly difficult. We wrestle with how God could ask such a thing of him. We'll get to more of that later. But we see in verse 3, it says, "Early the next morning." There's no hesitancy. We don't see Abraham argue or question or rationalize. He just gets up first thing the next day and goes about caring about what God has asked him to do. We also need to keep in mind that sacrificing children was actually a very normal cultural practice of the other pagans around them. So Abraham may not have thought that this was all that strange, except for the fact that God had told him that Isaac was the one. Isaac was the son of the promise, and he was supposed to have many descendants. But this practice would have been normal in the religions around them. So still we have this prompt and willing obedience from Abraham. And then we see that Abraham trusts in God's promises and his provisions, because we see that somehow as he walks along in what God has asked him to do, he trusts that what God has promised will come about. God has told him that Isaac is the one. He is the son of the promise. He will have many descendants. And so even though God has told him to sacrifice Isaac, somehow he believes that God is going to make this right. We see this in verse 5 when he says to the servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, then we will come back to you." There's this faith in Abraham that Isaac will be spared. And then he even tells Isaac the same thing when Isaac says, "Where's the sacrifice?" And Abraham says, "God himself will provide the lamb," in verse 8. Now, we don't know that Abraham has any idea what God is intending to do. But we also see in Hebrews that there's this belief that God could have raised Isaac from the dead. So in Hebrews 11, verses 17 through 19, it says, "By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead. Now, we don't know that Abraham had ever seen God raise anyone from the dead, and yet somehow he had belief in God's awesome power, and he had belief that somehow God would provide because of what he had promised. And then we see here the word at the beginning of verse 1 where God comes to test Abraham. That kind of bothers us because it kind of sounds like God's trying to be mean or tricky, like he's trying to catch him, like, do you really trust him? But really that word test means prove. What God is doing here is for Abraham's sake. He's trying to help Abraham reveal his faith, to prove his faith, to prove his commitment. It's not the same thing as tempting. God does not tempt us. Satan tempts us to fall. God tests us to reveal our faith. The purpose of this is so that we can know the depth of our own faith. We can know the depth of our own commitment. It helps us learn to trust, because when we're brought to the end of ourselves, we're brought to the point of lack where only God can provide, and he does, we learn to trust in a deeper way. It helps us learn to love God the most. Abraham was asked to give up something that he valued more than anything, and he was willing to do it for the sake of his love for God. The testing of our faith rises up to the surface those things that are the most important, and what we need to find is that God is the most important over all of these things. But it's interesting here because what we see in Genesis, in verse 12, it says, when God is talking to Abraham, it says, do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. Now, did God learn something new? God didn't learn something new. Abraham did. What God is saying is you have proved your faith. God knows everything. He can't learn anything new, but he's showing Abraham the depth of his faith. And we do see here that God provides. God provides a ram for the sacrifice in place of Isaac. If you were with us last year as we studied the names of God, we studied this story as Jehovah Jireh, the Lord will provide. And that we learned how that word provide actually means to see to it. Abraham was trusting that God would see to it, even though he didn't know how. And we see here how God does see to it. God provides. In verse 14, it says, Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. And remember, we talked about Genesis is a book about God. So even though we are learning here about Abraham's depth of faith and his obedience, the point here is that not that Abraham is found faithful, but that God is found faithful. He makes a promise and he's faithful to provide in order to protect that promise. Now, as we move into Genesis 23, we see some more passage of time, because at the end of 22, it says sometime later, and then it tells us that Sarah dies when she's 127. So keep in mind, if you do the math, Isaac would have been 37 at this point. So quite a bit of time has passed. And we see this interesting interaction between Abraham and the Hittites, this probably pretty normal cultural negotiation where they're trying to make it sound like, oh, no, that's fine, you just take it. And Abraham presses the issue and they keep negotiating. Finally, what's offered is what is thought to be an exorbitant price for this land. And Abraham, in his faithfulness and graciousness, still buys the land. Well, why is this significant? Because it's cultural. The customary practice was to bury your family members with your ancestors. Well, remember, they've left home many years ago. And instead of going back to what once was their home to bury Sarah, he claims that this spot, which doesn't belong to them yet, he claims that this spot is where God has called them to be. And so he begins a new burial ground for ancestors. Here, he puts down roots in a foreign land. It tells us, so that the field and the cave, all the trees within the borders of the field, was deeded to Abraham in as his property. So because Abraham buys it, he legally has right to this land. He's putting down roots in this land, trusting again. So we see Abraham trusting God for the future again, because he's already trusted God with his descendants. God had said there will be descendants, so he trusts him with Isaac. God has also told him, you will have this land, so he trusts him with this land, even though it's not yet his. So Abraham's kind of letting go of his past by leaving Ur. He's now releasing the future into God's hands by buying this land and burying his dead here, beginning a new place for their family line. And we see again that God provides. This place, Hebron, becomes pretty significant in Israelite history. Abraham could not have known that. He just knows he's going to buy this land to bury Sarah. And as we go on, we see the other patriarchs are buried here. We see that as a result of Caleb's obedience and faith in God, Hebron is deeded to Caleb as an enormous blessing. Hebron is where David becomes king, and he rules from there for the first several years before he moves his kingdom to Jerusalem. It's a significant place that Abraham chooses to put down roots, and then God provides for that and gives that land to the Israelites generations later. And then, of course, one of the things we see in this story in Genesis 22 is another promise for the future, the promise of the Messiah. We often see the correlation of how instead of Isaac, a ram is offered. We see this substitute, but there's a lot more incidences that points us to the gospel and points us to Jesus. So we're just going to run through these and see how there's a promise for the future. There's a promise of the Messiah. First, we see the sacrifice of an only son. This language is repeated in Genesis 22 because we're trying to show the significance about how Isaac is the only one. Take your son, your only son whom you love. And then we see echoes of those same words when God says about Jesus, you are my son whom I love. With you I am well pleased in Mark 1:11. And then of course in John 3:16, God gave his only son. We also see the willing obedience of a son to a father. At the time that this story would have taken place in Genesis 22, Isaac would have been at least a teenager, if not a young man, because of the years that have passed. Abraham was old. Isaac would have had to willingly get on the altar because he could have easily, physically overpowered Abraham. It was not forced upon him, but somehow Isaac shows a trust in Abraham. He shows a trust in God that he is willing to obey. He's willing to do what Abraham has said. And of course, we see that in Jesus too. In John 10:18, Jesus said, no one takes my life from me. I lay it down of my own accord. The willing obedience of a son to the Father. Another spot we see is that the wood was laid on the sacrifice. In Genesis 22:6, Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac. Isaac carries the wood to the place of the sacrifice. Similarly, Jesus carries his cross to the place of the sacrifice. The actual location of the sacrifice is the same. In Genesis 22:2, it talks about how God sends him to the region of Moriah, and that's where the sacrifice will take place. Well, in 2 Chronicles 3:1, we learn that Solomon began to build the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah. The temple is built in the same place as Moriah, where Abraham is told to sacrifice Isaac. We also see how the Father does not withhold his son. In verse 12, it says, do not lay a hand on the boy, do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. And in Romans 8:32, he says, he who did not spare or withhold his own son, but gave him up for us all. So we see that the Father does not withhold or does not spare his son. And of course, we see that God himself provides the necessary sacrifice. A substitution is made. So Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. Isaiah 53:5 tells us, he, Jesus, was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. And John 1:29 tells us, where John sees Jesus coming and says, look, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. A substitution is made by God himself. And then lastly, we see being raised to life on the third day. Now, while Isaac didn't suffer an actual death, he did labor under a death sentence for 3 days. In verse 4, it talks about how they traveled for 3 days to get to this place. And then on the third day, when the substitution is made, life has come. And of course, we know that Jesus was raised to life on the third day. Just a few final thoughts here, that the testing of Abraham was a gift because it showed him the depth of his own faith. He learned that he valued God above all else, even above his precious son whom he loved. But what's interesting too, I think, is that Abraham is chosen as the father of faith, but Abraham is also chosen to be the one to get the closest look at the gospel story that we see in all of the Old Testament. Look at all the ways that the sacrifice of Isaac lines up with the sacrifice of Jesus. Abraham comes the closest, without actually having to endure the pain, to God's heart of what he had to endure when he gave up Jesus for us. That is a privilege that Abraham got to experience. I also wanted to look at this idea of putting down roots in a foreign land that we see in chapter 23. We too are aliens and strangers in this land, just like Abraham was called with the Hittites. He was a foreigner, and yet he chooses to place down roots in a future place that he knows God has promised. We choose to put down roots in eternity. That is our promised land. That is what has been told will be given to us as a future inheritance. And so as we travel here as aliens and strangers, our roots are placed in the promised land of eternity, of our future. And then just one note, because we are just in the Christmas season, how we can tie this in. Obviously, Jesus has come and he will fulfill all of these things in the promise of the Messiah. But I want us to take a look at Mary. And her response is so similar to Abraham's, because when the angel comes to her and gives her this enormously difficult task, her response is, I am the Lord's servant. May it be to me as you've said. She has this willing servant heart, this willingness to obey. And while Abraham was spared the suffering of losing his son, Mary was not. Mary had to endure the pain and the grief of watching her son die. And yet she was faithful and she was obedient and she was God's servant. And yet, while she didn't see the substitution for her son, she saw her son be the substitution for the whole world, the Lamb of God for all, not just for one. So may we be willing to be obedient, willing servants, willing to surrender all, to participate with the grander story that God is writing, because we know that God will always be faithful to his promises, and God will always provide. God bless you.